Okay, so you want to own a nuclear power plant, buy some land, pour a few million tons of concrete, split some uranium atoms, boil water, and watch the cash roll in every time a city turns on its lights. Or a massive tech company trains an AI model. It sounds like the ultimate infinite money glitch. You are producing the most valuable commodity in the modern world. Electricity with zero carbon emissions, running 24 hours a day, regardless of whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. Here's the strange part. It is the only legal business on earth that produces a product for almost zero marginal cost. Yet it is so financially toxic that the smartest energy executives on the planet have spent the last 30 years absolutely terrified of building one. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why this machine is the ultimate paradox of modern capitalism, how a nuclear power plant actually makes its money on a grid that was never designed for it, why the fuel inside the reactor is the cheapest part of the entire operation, what a nuclear decommissioning trust is, and why it means you have to pay $1 billion just to make your own building disappear, and why, after decades of bankruptcies and abandoned projects, the biggest tech companies in the world are suddenly buying up every single nuclear reactor they can get their hands on in 2026. Let us start with what it actually costs to get in. If you want to own a nuclear power plant, you have two choices. You can build a new one, or you can buy an old one. If you choose to build a new one, you're not really entering the energy business. You are entering the business of fighting time, interest rates, and the federal government. The United States just finished building 2 brand new nuclear reactors in Georgia, known as Plant Vogtle Units 3 and 4. When the project was originally approved, the estimated cost was roughly $14 billion, and it was supposed to be finished by 2017. The actual final cost, when the second reactor finally flipped the switch in 2024, was over $34 billion. $34 billion. That is not just construction materials. That is the cost of regulatory delays. Design changes required mid-construction, and most importantly, the cost of capital. When you borrow $10 or $15 billion to build a power plant, you start paying interest the day the loan clears. Every single month of delay costs you tens of millions of dollars in interest alone, while the plant generates exactly zero revenue. You're paying a mortgage on the most expensive building in human history for 7 years longer than you planned. This is why nobody wants to build a new traditional gigawatt-scale nuclear plant from scratch. The upfront capital risk is so massive that a single bad supply chain delay can bankrupt the utility company backing it, which is exactly what happened to Westinghouse, the original contractor for the Georgia plant. So if building a new one is a financial death sentence, your second option is to buy an existing plant on the secondary market. And this is where the economics get completely surreal, because for a brief period in the 2010s, existing nuclear power plants were considered so unprofitable that energy companies were literally giving them away or shutting them down entirely. In 2014, Duke Energy sold the Crystal River nuclear plant in Florida. In 2019, Entergy sold the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station in Massachusetts. These were fully functioning engineering marvels capable of powering entire cities, and they were changing hands for a fraction of what it would cost to build a simple natural gas plant. Why were they so cheap? Because of how the electricity market actually works. When you own a nuclear plant, you do not control the price of your product. You sell megawatts into a wholesale electricity market. For decades, the price of electricity in the United States was dictated by the price of natural gas. Because natural gas plants are cheap to build and easy to turn on and off. When the fracking boom hit and natural gas prices collapsed, the wholesale price of electricity collapsed with it. A nuclear power plant cannot just turn off when prices are low. It takes days to safely ramp down a reactor and days to bring it back up. So a nuclear plant runs at 100% capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pumping power into the grid regardless of whether the market price is $50 a megawatt hour or negative $5 a megawatt hour. Yes, negative. In some markets, when wind and solar are overproducing in the middle of the day, electricity prices actually drop below zero. Your nuclear plant is still running, meaning you are literally paying the grid to take your electricity. You're stuck operating a rigid, immovable giant in a market that rewards flexibility. But wait, you might say, doesn't a nuclear plant have incredibly cheap fuel? Yes, the physics of nuclear energy are a financial miracle. A single uranium fuel pellet, the size of a gummy bear, contains as much energy as 1 ton of coal, 149 gallons of oil, or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Fuel costs make up roughly 20% of a nuclear plant's total operating expenses. For a natural gas plant, fuel can be 70 to 80% of the cost. Once a nuclear reactor is loaded with fuel, it runs continuously for 18 to 24 months without needing a single delivery truck. If there's a pipeline freeze, a hurricane, or a global energy crisis, your plant does not care. The cost to generate the actual electricity is phenomenally low, but the fuel is the only thing that is cheap. Everything else about the operation is staggeringly expensive because you're not just running a power plant, you're running a heavily regulated civilian fortress. A standard 2-unit nuclear power plant requires roughly 600 to 800 full-time employees to operate. These are not minimum wage jobs. You are paying senior reactor operators, nuclear engineers, specialized welders, radiation protection managers, and a dedicated, heavily armed paramilitary security force that guards the perimeter 24 hours a day. The payroll alone runs into the tens of millions of dollars a year. Then there's the regulator. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, oversees every single thing you do. The NRC charges the plant owner for its oversight. In recent years, the hourly rate for an NRC inspector was roughly $300 an hour. A single plant can pay millions of dollars a year just in regulatory fees to the government, on top of millions more in insurance premiums mandated by federal law. And then comes the single most stressful and expensive event in the entire business model, the refueling outage. Every 18 to 24 months, your reactor runs out of fresh fuel. You cannot just pull up to a pump and top it off. You have to shut the entire reactor down, open the containment vessel, and swap out exactly 1/3 of the highly radioactive fuel assemblies while moving the old ones into a massive indoor swimming pool called a spent fuel pool, because your plant makes no money when it is turned off. This process is a race against time. The industry average for a refueling outage is about 30 days. During those 30 days, you hire an extra 1,000 specialized contractors who descend on the plant to perform thousands of maintenance tasks, X-raying pipes, testing emergency diesel generators, replacing valves, all while the reactor is open. A single outage can cost $20 to $40 million in direct labor and materials. But that is not the real cost. The real cost is the lost revenue. If your plant normally generates $1.5 million a day selling electricity, being shut down for 30 days means you just lost $45 million in top-line revenue. If a tool drops into the reactor pool, or an inspector finds a crack in a steam generator tube, your outage extends by a week. That is another $10 million gone. The difference between a profitable year and a catastrophic year for a nuclear plant almost entirely depends on exactly how many days it stays offline during the spring outage. If you survive the regulatory fees, the massive payroll, and the 30-day outages, you eventually face the ultimate trapdoor in the nuclear business: the end of the plant's life. When a coal plant or a solar farm reaches the end of its useful life, you knock it down, sell the scrap metal, and walk away. When a nuclear plant reaches the end of its life, you enter a process called decommissioning, and it is a financial nightmare. You are left with a massive concrete structure filled with radioactive components that take decades to safely dismantle and package into special casks. The federal government requires you to have the money to pay for this before it even happens. It is called a nuclear decommissioning trust. Over the life of the plant, you are forced to siphon off a portion of your revenue and invest it in a massive trust fund. The average cost to decommission a single nuclear reactor is roughly $1 billion. In some cases, it takes more than a decade of careful demolition to return the site to a greenfield state. And even then, because the United States never built a permanent storage facility for nuclear waste, you are stuck guarding the highly radioactive spent fuel rods in concrete casks on your property indefinitely. You have to maintain an armed security force for decades to watch over a parking lot full of concrete cylinders for a power plant that no longer exists and generates zero revenue. For decades, this exact math is why the nuclear industry was stagnant. The upfront costs were too high. The operational costs were bloated. Natural gas was too cheap, and the decommissioning liability was terrifying. But then, right around 2024, and accelerating completely in 2026, the entire economic model of the universe flipped upside down. Artificial intelligence arrived, the major tech companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, realized that they were building data centers so massive that the regular electrical grid could no longer support them. A modern hyperscale AI data center consumes hundreds of megawatts of electricity. Wind and solar cannot power them because AI models do not stop training when the wind stops blowing. Natural gas plants produce too much carbon, ruining the tech companies' climate pledges. There is exactly one technology on planet Earth that provides hundreds of megawatts of zero-carbon electricity 24 hours a day, perfectly uninterrupted. Nuclear. Suddenly, the rigid, immovable giant that nobody wanted became the most valuable piece of real estate in the tech industry. In 2024, Amazon bought a massive data center campus directly connected to the Susquehanna nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, paying $650 million just for the real estate and the right to pull power straight from the reactor. Microsoft signed a 20-year deal to guarantee the purchase of all the electricity from a restarted reactor at 3 Mile Island, essentially funding the resurrection of a plant that had been abandoned because the tech giant was so desperate for clean baseload power. This changes everything. Instead of selling your electricity into the chaotic wholesale grid, hoping the price of natural gas stays high enough for you to turn a profit, you now sign a 20-year power purchase agreement, or PPA, directly with a trillion-dollar tech company. They agree to pay you a massive premium, sometimes over $100 a megawatt hour, guaranteed for 2 decades. They take all the market risk. You get a guaranteed bond-like return on your reactor. The same plant that was losing money 5 years ago is now a cash printing machine because the buyer is no longer the local utility customer. The buyer is an AI supercomputer that literally cannot function without you. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you make if you own a nuclear plant? 2 scenarios. Real numbers. Scenario 1. The traditional merchant operator, you buy a single unit, 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant in the Midwest. You sell power to the open grid. In a year where natural gas prices are low and winter is mild, wholesale electricity prices hover around $30 a megawatt hour. Your plant generates about 8 million megawatt hours a year, giving you $240 million in gross revenue. But your operating costs, the 600 employees, the NRC fees, the security force, and the annualized cost of your refueling outage run you about $220 million. You put another $10 million into the Decommissioning Trust. You are left with $10 million in net profit on an asset that costs billions to replace. One unpredicted equipment failure that shuts the plant down for an extra 2 weeks will wipe out your entire profit margin for the year. You are carrying massive risk for a tiny, fragile reward. Scenario 2. The 2026 hyperscale data center model. You own the exact same 1,000 megawatt plant. But instead of selling to the grid, you sign a 20-year direct contract with Microsoft or Amazon to power their new AI campus built right outside your security fence, because they are desperate for clean, firm power to meet their AI deployment schedules. They agree to pay you $80 a megawatt hour, fixed, with an annual inflation escalator. Your exact same 8 million megawatt hours now generates $640 million a year in guaranteed revenue. Your operating costs are exactly the same, $220 million. You're clearing over $400 million a year in pure gross profit. You have no market volatility, no natural gas price risk, and your customer is a company with a $2 trillion market cap that physically cannot default on the bill. The difference between barely breaking even and making $500 million a year isn't anything the engineers inside the control room did differently. It is the simple fact that the product they make, baseload zero-carbon electricity, suddenly found a customer who values reliability over absolute cost. That is the actual economics of owning a nuclear power plant. It is a business defined by extremes. It relies on the most complex, unforgiving physics of any commercial industry, managed by a workforce that has to operate with literal military precision, overseen by a regulator that can shut you down in an afternoon. It is sitting on a decommissioning liability so large it requires its own sovereign wealth fund to manage. For 30 years, it was an economic dinosaur, too expensive to build, too rigid to operate, and too costly to tear down. But if you own one today and you plug it directly into the backbone of the artificial intelligence revolution, you suddenly possess the ultimate monopoly. You own the only machine on Earth that can boil water with a handful of uranium and feed the hungriest computers ever built, completely isolated from the chaos of the outside world. The paradox of the nuclear plant is finally solved. The most expensive way to boil water is now the only way to invent the future.